I'm glad you are joining us this day as we recognize again the greatness and goodness of our Lord. We recognize how important it is for us to submit to His will, to yield our heart, our mind, ourself fully to Him. Consider this prayer. Make it your prayer today. Have thine own way, Lord. He hadn't seen his aunt since he graduated from high school. Now that she was in the nursing home, his mother strongly encouraged him, I really would appreciate if you would visit her. And so he went to see her, and the first thing he said to his aunt as he smiled at her, he said, "Do you recognize who I am?" And she looked long and hard, and she said, "Well, you sound familiar, you look familiar, but I really don't know who you are. But if you don't know who you are, if you just go down to the nurse's station, they'll tell you exactly who you are." So, well, it's one thing to ask, who am I? It's quite another thing to ask the question, what are other people saying about me? Have you ever said that to anybody? What are other people saying about me? Do you think you received a truthful answer? Well, Jesus asked his disciples that question. What are people saying about me? Let's listen in to the conversation. Reading this morning, Matthew chapter 16, beginning in verse 13. Who do people say I, the Son of Man, am? The disciples answered. Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. Did Jesus receive a truthful answer? Well, the answer is true, but it's not the whole truth. It seems the disciples were trying to protect Jesus, keeping something from him, trying to keep him from being discouraged, because the worst things that were said about Jesus weren't being said about the disciples. They didn't say that. Some people are saying, you're a false prophet or a false teacher. Others, worse, were saying, you're a blasphemer. And even worse, those who admitted, yes, Jesus does miracles, but it's by the power of the devil and that he was demon-possessed. Some people were saying terrible things about Jesus, but nobody was saying he was just a carpenter, for he was more than a carpenter. And then Jesus changes the question from whom do others say that I am to who do you say that I am? I am not surprised that Simon Peter is the first to speak. He's like the student, so eager to answer the question, he raises his hand before the teacher gets the whole question out. Peter is often the first one out of the gate. He was the first one to leave his net and fishing net on the shore when Jesus called the disciples. When there was a storm and Jesus came to the disciples walking on water, he was the first and the only one out of the boat. On the Mount of Transfiguration, he was the first to speak. At the Last Supper, when Jesus said, "There is one who is going to betray me," Peter was the first to say, "Lord, the rest may, but I will never betray you." He was the one first to draw his sword and the only one to use his sword in the garden when they came to arrest Jesus. And for his answer to that question, for Peter said, "Jesus, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And for that, Peter receives the highest praise and an unexpected promise. Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for this has not been revealed to you by flesh or by blood. And I say unto you, Peter, that on this rock I will build thy church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I give to you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bound on earth will be bound on heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed on heaven." And then he warned the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Christ. Have you learned this lesson yet? There is a time to speak and a time to be silent. This was not a time for them to add to the public controversy about Jesus' identity, not a time to add to their danger. Jesus continues, verse 21. From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders and the chief priests and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life. Once again, Peter is the first one out of the gate, but now his words receive no praise and no promise. Sometimes he hits the mark, sometimes he misses the mark, and sometimes he misses the mark very badly. Sometimes he speaks when he should remain silent. This is one of his worst verbal blunders, one of the kind that earns Peter the nickname the American Apostle, because he's so often putting his foot in his mouth. Too bad his toes weren't made of peppermint. He's the kind who thinks or speaks before he thinks. Do you know anybody like that? Speak first, think later. Well, this is the mistake Peter gave. He took Jesus aside, verse 22, and he began to rebuke Jesus. "Never, Lord," he said, "this shall never happen to you." Now it's my turn to ask the question, what is Peter thinking? Does he really think he knows better than Jesus? It's one thing to contradict a colleague. It's quite another to contradict Christ. Why does Peter insist this must never happen? Because Peter is a man with a plan, and his plan does not include the cross. Peter took it upon himself, made it his personal responsibility to prevent the death of Jesus, and was still trying to work the plan when they came to arrest him in the garden, and he drew his sword and attacked the enemy. On the night they arrested Jesus, Peter took action and made a decision. But it wasn't his decision to make. It wasn't his action to take. Do you ever make decisions for others that are not your decisions to make? As I mentioned earlier, there's a time to speak and a time to be silent, and there's a time to act and a time to restrain from acting. This was a time for Peter to give the reins of control over to Jesus, to let Jesus take the lead. This was difficult for Peter because Peter was a take charge kind of guy. There's a time to take charge, but there are times when it's not ours to interfere or act. On this occasion, Peter did not get it right. His heart was right, well-intentioned in wanting the best for Jesus, but his action and his words were wrong. At times in our life, things develop that are not to our liking. Worse than that, at times, things develop that are deeply distressing. Disaster strikes, disease comes, our dreams fall short, our plans derail, our efforts to secure and restore them prove inadequate. Our plans fail. Our dreams do not always come to pass, but God's plan and purpose is steadfast and it endures forever. This is the confidence by which we live. Things may not go as we want, but there's a higher will and a greater wisdom to which we yield ourselves. Well, Peter must was addressed by Jesus with these words, verse 23. Jesus turned to Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of men." Could any words cut any deeper? Moments before he was praised as the rock, but now he is accused of being a stumbling stone. Jesus had been tempted before by Satan in the wilderness 40 days when he was enticed to turn stones to bread, to leap off of the temple, or to bow down and worship the evil one. But this temptation is greater, for it's more difficult to resist, because the words are not spoken by his adversary, but by his deepest, dearest friend. How appealing the temptation must have been to Jesus to simply sidestep the cross, to take a detour, to look for another way, a way that he would judge to be easier, to be safer, less costly, a better way to establish his kingdom, to save sinners, to rescue lost sheep, to set the prisoner free. But the reality was, our redemption required the cross. Would Jesus alter his course? Would he redirect his steps? Would he unsay or undo or compromise his intentions? Would Jesus be a person to cut corners, to take shortcuts? It would be so tempting when facing a cross. But Jesus loved us too much, was too committed to his Father's will to do that. He never yet wavered, never yielded to the temptation. He stood strong and steady. Yes, to hear that Jesus was to be crucified had to be deeply disturbing to the disciples, not what they signed up for when they left their nets on the shore and followed him. But I wonder if the next statement was even more disturbing. For Jesus, in essence, said, not only is there a cross for me, he said to his disciples, there is a cross for you. He did so with these words, now verse 24. If anyone would come after me, they must deny themselves. They must take up their cross and follow me. How are we to understand? Take up your cross. Whatever adversity I face, I will see it as my cross, carry it to the glory of God and in the Spirit of Christ. Or does take up a cross speak only of the adversity and distress I face because of my direct obedience to Christ? Does the distinction matter? In either case, Jesus was preparing his disciples for their future. That would include pain and suffering, hardship and deprivation, shame and anguish. They too will be tempted, like Jesus, to skirt around it, to take a detour, to find another way, and easier way. And so too are we when we face God's will. There are times it seems so difficult and so hard that we're tempted to find a different way. Jesus tries to give perspective with these words, and does if we will accept them. Verse 25, for whoever wants to save their life must lose it, and whoever loses his life for me will find it. What good is it for a man if he gains the whole world and loses his soul? Or what can a man give in exchange for his soul? On another occasion, Jesus warned his followers, Matthew 17 and 13, enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter therein. But small is the gate and narrow is the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. Which is the road less traveled? It's not the easy road. It's not the smooth road, not the well-paved road, not the downhill road, not the trouble-free road. Which is easier to flow downstream or to swim upstream? Which is easier to stand against the tide or to submit to it? Usually the easy way, or maybe usually is an overstatement, but often the easy way proves to be the wrong way. Whether it's easy or hard is not what is important. What's important is if it's God's will. A man came to visit the pastor. He said, do you have 5 minutes for me? He said, I'm a very, very busy man. I really don't have time for this. I wish I didn't have to have this conversation, but you have 5-10 minutes at the most. I'm a busy man. I have my own company. I manage it by myself. I have employees. They're all dependent on me. But I really would like a conversation. The pastor said, by all means. What would you like to talk about? Well, I want to talk about my wife. Well, what about your wife? Well, the thing is, my wife has been attending your services now for a couple of months. And when she comes home from church and when I come home from work, all she wants to talk about now is Jesus. And so I came to ask you if you could give me a couple of quick bullet points about Jesus. And the pastor said, certainly. The most simple way to understand is this way, quoting from John 3:16. For God so loved the world, and God so loved you and your wife, that he gave his only begotten Son, whose name was Jesus. He gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him, he gave his Son for what? For the cross, to die for our sin, to redeem us. That whoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. And the pastor said, this is how the Christian life begins. John 3 says, this is the beginning of the Christian life. When we believe, we are born again. And the man then said, I appreciate that. And to what does it lead? And the man quoted from our text, Matthew chapter 16 and 24. If you would follow Jesus, you must deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow Jesus. And the man said, isn't there an easier way? How are we to answer that question? Isn't there an easier way? Inherent to many of the temptations that we face is the temptation of the easy way. What makes rivers crooked is the same thing that makes mankind's character crooked, choosing the path of least resistance. I think it was Derek Schinderly who told me this of one of his friends who was really into dirt biking, and not only into dirt biking, but dirt racing. So much so that he qualified or enrolled or raced that famous desert race down in Mexico, 600 miles in the Baja Desert. And he raced his heat, and he was so excited how well he did. He looked up on the big screen where the names were listed, and there he was, in 7th place, much better than he thought he would have done. He was so excited, he went to get some of his friends, and he just wanted them to see how well he had done. And they came, and he looked up on the marker that showed how the race was going, and there he was, but his name was not in 7th place. He was now shocked to discover he was in 1st place. 1st place, how can this possibly be? Because the first 7 racers of his heat had cheated and cut corners. And what they may not have known, for the first time, those overseeing the race had the GPS monitoring their course. The easy way. In the race of life, it's so tempting to look for the easy way. What we need to look for is the right way, or stated another way, we need to look for Christ's way. It's tempting, the easy way, to think we'll get what we want cheaper, sooner, without all the hassle, without the trouble. But we end up losers instead of winners, defeated instead of satisfied. It seems to me it's easier to hold a grudge than it is to forgive. It's often easier to tell the lie than to speak the truth. It's easier to neglect the discipline of our children than doing what we need to do. It's easier to indulge our appetites and seek to answer our desires than to discipline them. This temptation, the temptation of the easy way, exists in all aspects of our life. We want wealth without work, pleasure without restraint, health without exercise, loss of weight without changing our diet, happiness without responsibility, worship without sacrifice. We want to pay the lower shelf price and yet get the top shelf product. There is more to the Christian life than a get into heaven free. For we are called to be followers of Jesus. And that means what? Self-denial. That means dying to all that is wrong and evil. And that means following in the steps of Christ. We want blessings, but they will not come without effort. We want to experience the fruit of the Spirit. That will not happen without self-denial. We want the joys of Christ's kingdom and rule, but that will not happen without sacrifice. If anyone wants to be my disciple, they must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. Before you say the price is too high, think of the high price of not denying oneself and of yielding to temptation. You will lose out on the peace that passes all understanding. You will not experience the hope that is steadfast and sure, and the level of joy will be severely diminished in your life, and you will miss out on the rewards that God has promised to the faithful. So when you have a hard time deciding which path to choose, make sure, please, you choose the path over which the shadow of the cross falls. It will not be easy, but it will be worth it. It will be worth it all when you see Jesus. Life's trials will seem so small when you see Christ. One glimpse on his dear face, all sorrows will erase. So bravely run the race till you see Christ. And to run that race bravely means to submit our will to his will. Have thine own way, Lord, have thine own way. Thou art the potter, I am the clay. Mold me and shape me after thy will, while I am waiting, yielded and still. Let this be our prayer. Mark will present it for us with Catherine's aid, in a beautiful way through music, and it will change your life in the most wonderful of ways as you yield yourself to him.